Not yet. Okay. Now it does. Yeah. Okay. Good. So thank you very much for giving up your time and join us together to talk about student engagement and data and those sorts of things. I want to open probably slightly unexpectedly with a quotation from Michael Ondaatje, his novel In the Skin of the Lion. And he begins with this: the first sentence of every novel should be, "Trust me, this will take time, but there is order here. Very faint, very human. Meander if you want to get to town." So I want to begin thinking a little bit about meandering and a little bit about chaos. And I think talking a little bit about who I am and what brings me here today. So my name is Jill LeBihan. My title is Head of Student Engagement at Sheffield Hallam University, and I think probably it will become clear that that's not a role that I inhabit without some reservations. So the term of student engagement, and you can't see me, but I'm going to put air quotes around the term data, that term data that accumulates around student engagement, those are things that I want to explore a little bit today. So I'm going to keep a critical eye on what counts as data. I'm going to think about reflections on students working alongside staff. I'm going to think about thinking and time for thinking. If the Michael Ondaatje quotation didn't give you a clue, I'm an English literature specialist and we're not really data dealers. I think if you look at the other webinars in this series that have been delivered by my colleagues, you'll find out that we all glance slightly aslant at the term data and what that might mean in terms of the student experience. But also, and I'm going to talk very much about what that might mean for teachers as well. So the thinking time today, if you're listening to a recorded version, it won't be close to the end of term probably, but live it is close to the end of term, and there's a question for me about how much time people have had to think about teaching and their experience of learning this term, as opposed to just rocking up and kind of facing it. I want to say, as things go on, please do feel free to put comments in the chat box as we go through. I have the absent team, and I also have the fabulous Liz Austin with me in the room, and she's going to help me with discussion and picking up any comments that might whiz past as we go on. So please do go ahead and get involved in the thinking and discussion today. And I want to begin with some questions. And the first question is, can I ask why you're here today? If anyone wants to pop that in the chat box. It tests your typing skills. So an interest in active learning by students, a new role as a data champion. Ooh, that's good luck, is all I can say. Data champion. Did you get a medal for that? Yeah, so some collaborative activity. Yeah, I think that's good. Work with data more effectively, gather ideas about evaluation. Okay, yeah, and I think it is a challenge for speed typing. Okay, finding out about what's happening across the sector. Okay, So we're definitely, I mean, I think one of the things that's really helpful is, yeah, that someone's asking to do some learning and some thinking. So I'm really glad about that, because today's about learning and thinking, and a little bit about being together. So the questions I'm asking are now, do your replies count as auditable evidence of engagement? What is the status of these replies running in this chat box as data? Are they evidence of participant voice? You know, if I'm going to be recording this on my data controller and feeding it into my supply chain for evidence for various audit processes, you know, to what extent is this participant voice, and to what extent is this mute compliance? You know, I asked you a question and bless your hearts, out of kind pity, you decided to answer me, and I think that that's a really interesting, so that's behind some of what we're doing today, is that kind of the freedom to speak and what that might mean. And I hopefully circle back, meander back towards these replies towards the end as well. Just a final thing: is anyone a student today? You could be a student as well as a member of staff. Lots of us remain students of things. Any students in today who want to own up and put their hands up? Maybe not. Maybe it's all a non-student audience, which is a sabbatical officer. Thank you, Alice. Excellent. So you are a student of a kind. I think people count sabbatical officers very much as the student voice, whether you feel like that or not, actually, which is very interesting. Okay, so I want to, not do that. I want to talk about staff, students, and the rules of engagement. And I want to begin with an anecdote. Some anecdotal evidence is something that people have already brought up in the chat box. And I want to tell you a personal story as a teacher, as well as a teacher of English literature. I currently teach on the postgraduate certificate in teaching and learning in higher education, so our new staff course, as it's sometimes called. And twice a year I teach a session about student engagement and co-design with a cohort of new academic staff who are teaching at Hallam. As your experience of teaching will, I'm sure, tell you, every cohort is very different. You never know. You can teach the same material every year, but what happens will be very different. And one year I divided them into 4, and I gave them each an essay to read. And each essay was on higher education policy and student engagement. And they were all given essays that were very different in terms of written style. And one of my clusters objected to the essay that I'd given them, and they said really vocally, this isn't research, this is just anecdote. You know, what status is this? This is not real data. And I think that that's a really interesting question about what counts as data, particularly if you're a person like me from the humanities. So my data is literature, it is stories, it is fiction. And when I see the term narrative used in other disciplines, in education or in social science, I'm pretty sure they don't mean it in exactly the way that I mean narrative either. So I think there's a really interesting thing about that relationship between data, between voice, between story and narrative, and how we use that. You can see that I'm speaking from these places as a practitioner of teaching and learning, as a teacher, and very much speaking out of the humanities. And I think one of the objections that my students, who were also teachers, made in that class is a claim that student engagement is not a thing for the many. So you can't have meaningful data about it. You can only have data about the few. You have a cluster of super engagers, and then you have the disaffected many who you don't hear from at all. So we've got issues here that I'm meandering around about small numbers, anecdotal detail, and then big data, and somehow how those small numbers and those anecdotal details get swept up into big data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how student engagement as an approach might appear in the data, but as my title suggests, this is data critical talk. I'm critical of what counts as data, particularly when that's used to make judgments about the value and effectiveness of teaching. So for lots of us, we're thinking about evidence for teaching quality and what counts as evidence for teaching quality. And I'll fall back on an old mentor, an old resource, which is that of Freud. And he talks about teaching alongside healing and governing as an impossible profession. He says it's impossible to do. We fall, I think, between what he calls the Scylla and Charybdis, that you can't both do teaching and let people free with kind of on a leash, without kind of having a leash on them. You have to constrain what they learn in some ways, but that constraint causes damage. So for Freud, education is this fine balance between achieving the most and damaging the least. I think a bit like, as he says, the healer, a bit like medicine, try to do no harm. And I think that is perhaps the best explanation of what we're trying to do no harm. And I think, how do we measure that? How do we measure whether we're doing good or whether we're doing harm? How do we use stories and voices as data? And in particular, how does that emerge? What format does that come in? So if you think about scripts, if you think about formats, if you think about when you rock up to your healer, to your GP with a story about yourself and about what's happening, it takes a particular format. There are particular expectations about what you can say and what you can't say. And I think that that's quite interesting. So there's an expectation about genre that influences what you can say. There are also other things. There's, if you like, in the Freudian terms, there's fear of the superego, the kind of management and control, politeness, if you will. So, just social politeness. Those are also control what you say, and they influence what you say. But I think that that's insufficiently taken into account when we are looking at student stories and their voices when they become data. How is the format, the genre, producing what they can say? And I think we're probably very, very aware of this in things like the National Student Survey or module evaluation questionnaires, or in a student union watchdog report. That sense that students and people are influenced by a script of what counts as data. The rigidity of the questions, apart from anything else, determines that. I think, but there's also a sense of whether then, if they say things that are not within that circumscribed script, how we capture those, or whether we lose them. And I think that for me is, how do we cope with the things that don't fit in the script? There's a whole bunch of little things coming down the side, the comments down the side in the conversation. How do we capture that as data in a meaningful way, and does it mean anything? In 2017, I did a bit of research on the teaching excellence framework's narrative and engagement. I know in the Scottish sector your requirements around the teaching excellence framework are a little bit different for those of us in England, but I think nevertheless, even if it's not for a teaching excellence framework, there usually is a submission document required that talks about and tries to measure teaching excellence. And I think I probably haven't got time here to rattle on about the nature of the supplement from post-structuralist French philosophy. I think that would take us too much on a meander round on the wrong path. But I think that the Teaching Excellence Framework does provide a fascinating set of documents that play out the relationship between the narrative and the metrics, the words and the numbers. And you know, to the hilarity of all of my colleagues, I am virtually innumerate. And so there are lots of people in my team who are doing the data and the numbers, and unless it's somehow transcribed into a narrative, I can't really make sense of it. So there is a really interesting relationship between those numbers and the story you tell. If you have in the TEF, in the Teaching Excellence Framework, if you have the right set of numbers, you get your glitter ball, you get your trophy, you get your badge. So that's absolutely fine. But if you have the right words, you can talk up your numbers. And I think for me, that's a really interesting thing. How is it that the language, that the words, the stories do something with the data? So I've written about this with my colleagues, Christina Hughes and Carol Taylor. And when we looked at it in 2017, the institutional narrative was a new genre. It was a new format. I think now it's got to the point where it's so familiar that I've actually seen parodies of it. So people know now what a Teaching Excellence Framework institutional narrative needs to contain. But the script is both really interestingly, I think, an enabler and a constraint. It tells you that there are certain things that you're required to say. So, for instance, in the language of the Teaching Excellence Framework, you are required to talk about split metrics. That is the language of it, which are the kind of the way in which you split down your numbers into kind of diverse streams of student data to identify, for instance, ethnic minority students, or to identify students with disabilities and those kinds of things. But that hides as much as it reveals, it seems to me, because what you can do is, if your numbers aren't sufficient, you don't talk about things. It's very easy, and this is absolutely true of the 2017 narratives, that they can talk about student support, they can definitely identify what's in place for disabled students because there's an income stream that you can count by, but they hide away, for example, from issues around minoritized ethnic groups because, the numbers aren't robust enough. We can't talk about those minoritized groups because we don't have robust numbers. And so the numbers are really interesting because they enable you to talk about certain things, but they also enable you to duck other really awkward questions, it seems to me. The other thing is that some data, if it doesn't kind of fall into the right narrative format, doesn't count. I think something like the hashtag #MeToo movement gives people a format for disclosure. It gives people a format for talking about abuse. And what that turned out to do was reveal large numbers of serial attackers. And I think that's really interesting, but it also creates a constrained format that in some ways, if there aren't many voices supporting an accuser, if an accuser doesn't come out and then a whole train of other accusers come out behind her, somehow that narrative is not believed. The story doesn't fit the required format and it's discounted. So only certain concerns emerge in narrative. And in the TEF narratives, teaching and learning emerges, academic support emerges, employability, skills development. Actually, student engagement falls really quite a long way behind in terms of concerns in the data around the TEF narrative. And what happens in those stories as well, in those narratives, is that they leave out what I would call affect entirely. So they leave out emotion entirely. In these stories about teaching evaluation, there is no room for emotion. And I think that is really quite an interesting thing about what is enabled and disenabled by the script. Okay. So I want to ask you, to think about genre as an enabling thing, but also as a constraint. And with that in mind, for me, ask you a question, which is, does your institution have a branded student as partners scheme? I know that in Scotland, some of you will have a student partnership agreement, which might circumscribe that. But do you have a student as partners scheme, and what would you call it? Does it have a label, a badge, an icon? Has everyone gone to sleep already? It's possible. So yeah, partnership agreements people have. There are lots of terms for this. Yeah, just talk about partnership agreements in Scotland. Okay. Yeah, so everyone has partnership agreements. Do you have a different, yeah, oh, that's interesting. Does branding turn it into something less authentic? A student action group for engagement, that's quite interesting. Yeah. Someone says that, that it sits behind the strategy as an important value, a student partnership identity. I mean, there are lots of interesting terms. Achieved in partnership. Okay, that's interesting. An expectation of co-creation. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking of these sorts of labels. We have groups of students called peer educators here. I've seen students labelled ambassadors, mentors, colleagues. Students as colleagues is a scheme I've seen. I think that's a Scottish scheme, Napier. We've seen students as change agents. So there are different kind of labels that are given to these things, and I think, yeah, how does a value rather than a scheme become an action? Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, isn't it? So I think there is a question about how we value these relationships with students, and whether having a label for it, a formal partnership agreement, acts as an enabler or a constraint. In other words, if you have a partnership agreement, presumably there is an expectation that you do something. There's an expectation on staff that they engage. I don't know whether that means there's an expectation on students that they engage as well. So, and I guess that question for me is about how voluntary this is for staff and students. Are they volunteering to do this work? Is it paid work? Is it institutional duty? And also, I suppose, the question for me about whether only certain things count. So in that staff and student partnership, that relationship, do some things count, some partnerships, some relationships count, and some things not? Alison Cook-Sather and her colleagues in their Engaging Students as Partners book talk about a shift from individual to programmatic approaches of working alongside students. And I think that that's quite an interesting thing. Institutionally, we're moving towards programmatic expectations. They are in partnership agreements. We are expected to do these things. But I think there's also equally that question about whether it's voluntary and what happens if people are expected to sign up to them. I'm sure people have seen Bruce McFarlane's work. His work on student academic freedom and student engagement is a really interesting protest against partnership working and student engagement. And he argues that the tools of performance management have been brought into the university seminar so that there's a kind of loss of trust and what he calls a perversion of behaviours. That is, things like students being forced to attend when they might be better reading at home, for example, that they perform engagement, they act it out in order for it to kind of be counted as data. So there's a kind of, he talks a little bit about an always present culture, and there's an always present culture that's also in the UK workforce that doesn't necessarily improve productivity or improve quality. And Macfarlane says that actually the requirement to demonstrate engagement, to act it out, to perform it is perhaps at odds with the ideal of a university as a place where students are free to develop their critical thinking and their resistance, that student engagement becomes this kind of compliance action. And I think, yeah, so people have talked about contract here and that way in which, you know, people are tied in and bound into something, which is really, really interesting. The other thing that Macfarlane talks about, and this is significant for me in terms of what I'm discussing here as narrative and script, is the sense that we should be part of a confession culture, that we're required to disclose things about what we think and what we feel in our evaluations, in our anecdotal evidence. And that for him that kind of adherence to a confession culture is deeply problematic. And I think that that's quite interesting. I mean, for me, I worry less about it. Confession is a rule-bound process. Confession is a kind of schematic narrative. I don't think it's any more authentic than anything else, actually. So you could absolutely produce a confession or an anecdotal story about yourself, and it'd be total fiction. And actually, if it doesn't fit in the required format, people won't be able to use it anyway. It will just fall off the edge. People won't recognise it as that. So there's very much a sense in which engagement, student engagement, and the way we measure it is a problem as much as it is a benefit. I will shamelessly plug here the RAISE, the Researching, Advancing and Inspiring Student Engagement Conference, which is taking place next September, so September 2019. The conference theme is exploring the impact of student engagement. So precisely that issue around how we measure student engagement and what it does is that issue for RAISE in the coming year. There's also lots and lots, as I'm sure you're aware, organisations and journals supporting student engagement and partnership work in a very positive way. So, you know, there are people like Bruce Macfarlane and many others who have a kind of a critical engagement with the term around students as partners, but there are also many other journals, and I think Lucy Mercer Mapstone's and all her students' systematic literature review is an amazing place to start when you're kind of starting out in this area and having a look. All the resources will be available at the end so that you can track all of these things if you want to follow up on any of the further reading. Yeah, okay. That's very interesting. I'm trying to read and think about what I'm saying and read your comments along the side. By and large, I think the student partnership agreements are read as being quite a positive thing, mutually beneficial, a supportive thing. I think our experience of it here at Sheffield Hallam has been a struggle to make it a live document, a dynamic document, and keep it moving. You know, the minute you turn something into an agreement, it kind of turns a little bit static, and it's very difficult to create it dynamically. I wanted very briefly, and I'm looking at the time here, to talk about an experience of students as working as peer educators and what that has meant. that, and some of the rules around that, and whether people think that those rules are in place, perhaps in your partnership agreements, in a way that seem quite obvious. Very recently, we recruited a group of peer educators, student peer educators, as part of one of our Catalyst funded projects working around sexual harassment agendas. And we had 20 students that we recruited. They were paid during training, they were paid for the work that they did. And we, as out of that 20, a very hardcore group of about 8 kind of hung on and really progressed the work. It was an extracurricular activity. They weren't being assessed on it, but they were being paid for their time. And I thought there were some really interesting things for me about working with them as extracurricular educators rather than as part of the curriculum, because it meant that I didn't have to worry. Their investment was in terms of money, so I didn't have to worry about them and their engagement as such in the way that you would do if you were assessing them. I worried about looking after them and keeping track of them, but essentially, if they wanted the hours, they kind of came and they did the work, and if they didn't want the paid hours, they didn't, and those things were completely open in our contract. But one of the things that was really amazing about this group was their capacity for mutual support, their capacity, what I call the WhatsApp generation, that you let them loose in a room and they immediately form a WhatsApp group and are able to talk to one another and problem solve amongst themselves. And it was, for me, it was very much about trusting them to do their own thing. They had to fill out a form for hours, to claim their hours, and that was also a self-reflective document for them, which was a way of helping them think about perhaps getting an extracurricular award or thinking about the work they were doing on their CV. And we very much, myself and the people looking after them, tried to have mentoring relationships with the students. But actually, they got away and did things themselves. They did things in ways that I would never have chosen to do. They wanted the work that they were doing with other students to be clearly linked to an employability agenda in a way that I wouldn't have suggested. They wanted instructor t-shirts in order to mark themselves out as peer educators very clearly and give themselves status in that group. They wanted certificates to be provided for the participants, for that clear status and value. They wanted to deliver things face-to-face and not online, whereas I'd assumed that they might want to do things online. They developed their own social media logo, their own identity, and I thought that having that freedom was extraordinary. What they were capable of doing that when I wasn't kind of really needed to supervise them. So all I was doing there was kind of looking in and making sure that they were okay. So the group were engaged, they did the stuff, it was student led, all the things that I think are supposed to be positives. But I think what's really interesting is that then you are not part of that group. So you can't count what they're doing. You can't evaluate it in the same way. You don't have the data on it because they're doing it out there somewhere on their own. And I think that kind of measure of their engagement, how engaged they were, was also how independent they were, and then how we assess the value of that. And, for our funders and reporting back for our funders as much as anything else, proved to be reasonably difficult. And I think that that's a really interesting thing, that thing about teaching pleasure, that we're sometimes teaching and learning together. We're sometimes gathering around a subject, and this is something that Kathleen Quinlan has talked about. And she also talks very importantly about creating self-directed learning groups. This, she says, is an economic measure, which is really important for us. But I think it is really, really also hard then to measure the success of a group if we are not part of it. So we send them off, they do their own thing. We're incredibly proud of them, but that it does provoke certain kinds of problems, I think, for evaluation. And there are benefits to us being outside the group. I think the students solve a lot of problems by themselves on their WhatsApp, actually. But it's really, really difficult to make claims or even measure things, perhaps, when we're not part of it. And that's a really interesting thing. So there's the other thing that I think I wanted to talk about here, and I'll just move swiftly on because I can see the time ticking away, is that issue of separation, difference. We put them out there in their autonomous groups, but there's also that value of wanting to work alongside them, to work closely with them, the pleasure of the pedagogic relationship. And so I wanted very quickly to ask you whether you have a favourite role model or a favourite representation of teaching, either from fiction or from popular culture. What's your idealised teaching model? Is it the group, the WhatsApp group, who are off there separately doing their learning by themselves in an action group, or is it something else? Do you have an ideal image? Oh yeah, Good Will Hunting, good old Robin Williams. And the last Dead Poets Society as well. That's a Dead Poets Society gets me. Any others? I'm interested in how we idealise teachers. That's sad, Stella. No teachers you idealise. While you're thinking about, yeah, Dumbledore. Oh, excellent. Now, anyone would have thought I'd put you up to that. But really interestingly, Dumbledore, I love Dumbledore as a model of teaching, actually. But I've got a couple of others from Hogwarts, and Lupin is absolutely, so Professor Lupin is really interesting as the encouraging teacher, the enabling teacher, in some ways still quite traditional, because he doesn't allow risks in his classroom. He stops Harry from facing the boggart because he's afraid of what might come out. So he's not without being risk averse. Really interestingly, in the Order of the Phoenix, you have a self-directed group. You have Dumbledore's army, which is led by Harry as the student and teacher, and they are subverting the managerial, the data controlling Professor Umbridge in their student group. And I really love that as a model for a student group. But the last one, and I couldn't get away without this, the last idealised model for me of a teaching and learning relationship is Stacey and Kevin from Strictly. And what's really fascinating for me about this relationship is that it's not about the absolute learning outcomes. It's not about the best dancer. Poor Faye was robbed. Some of it is ipsative. It is about how far Stacey has come, what they refer to as the journey. But I also think it's about that teacher-student relationship. It's about absolute trust. It's about patience. It's support. It's encouragement. It's challenge. But in the end, the reason they won, I think, is it's about emotion. It's about affect. It is about the kind of the feelings in that relationship. It is all about the partnership. And I think that is really a really interesting representation. They talk a lot about numbers and technique and the technical aspects of dance, but in the end no one cares what the judges think. They go for something else, something that evokes an emotion rather than the kind of the core learning, if you like. And I think that our investment in that as an audience is absolutely fascinating, particularly when teachers are often criticised rather than fetishised, actually, in the way that they are in Strictly. So what? I hope that we've had an opportunity to think and have a conversation. I think I hope that there are some suggestions about Christmas reading. Certainly your Christmas reading is going to involve Mary Poppins and the Harry Potter sequence, if nothing else. And actually, if all else fails, you can watch the Strictly reruns, can't you, on the BBC website, and look at that fetishized teacher-student relationship all over again. I hope we've had some time to think and reflect on teaching and student engagement relationships. And I want to end where I started, actually, with In the Skin of a Lion. Ondaatje says, only the best art can order the chaotic tumble of events. Only the best can realign chaos to suggest both the chaos and the order it will become. I hope you have time to think about this, and the order will become clear out of the chaos when you've had a little bit of chance for the dust to settle. The references are there, and they'll be there on the recording if you want to have a look at them. And I think that's it for me.